Welcome, everyone, to another exciting episode of Archaeology After Dark. I am your host, Daniel Rhodes, once again. My guest today is Rebekah Dutton. Rebekah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, no problem.
So tell us about yourself.
So I have a master's degree in ancient Near Eastern archaeology from Wheaton College. This was my second career after doing technical writing for several years. So I specialize in the Near East, but Alabama archaeology is a new thing for me. I've been really enjoying it working with a cultural resource management company in Huntsville, Alabama. And that's where I grew up. And then moved away for a while. So I'm back in town and getting to know some new Southeastern archaeology.
So, when talking about archaeology just as a practice, where do you think is a good place to start?
As a practice, I feel like if you've decided that you think you want to study archaeology, my best recommendation is to start at a field school somewhere or find a tourist version of an archaeological dig somewhere like New England, where they have several digs going in colonial era houses. See if you like the field work um, and go from there because so much archaeology is field work. If you can survive that, you can survive the research. But if you're not a dirt person, then see if you like the research. Do an essay, write a short article about it.
So, you said you studied Near East archaeology. For people who are unfamiliar with the area of study, what is that?
So ancient Near Eastern archaeology, it's old world archaeology, and the specialty is in what we would call the modern day Middle East. My specialty primarily was Israeli studies, but other Near Eastern archaeologists may be looking at Egyptology, they may be looking at Mesopotamia or Anatolia or modern day Turkey archaeology. So this is a bit more ancient in some aspects from New World archaeology, but there are a lot of transferable ideas and practices between the two.
Can you give us a couple of examples?
Um, so the fieldwork is very similar. Um, there are a few just different standard practices that are different between the two, but it's not bad. Um, the primary similarities is just the idea of concurrent development. So any society is going to develop in very similar ways. They're going to begin domestication practices of plants and animals. They'll develop tools in very similar ways, usually starting with your stone chip tools. And eventually they progress to ceramics, and from ceramics on. One of the major differences between ancient Near Eastern archaeology and especially Southeastern archaeology is the absence of written text. So in the ancient Near East, we have writing beginning around 3000 BC. And in the Southeastern United States, we really don't have a lot of written text from the very early societies and cultures in the US. So that does make up a very vast difference between the two, is just that language study. But that adds a more exciting element to American archaeology because you have a bit more ethno-archaeological research looking into what modern day traditions reach back and say about those objects you're finding.
So, when you say written records, that means there isn't actually something you can go back and reference while you're studying the actual artifacts. You have more room to, I guess, interpret it personally.
I think so. I think it does leave a lot more room for interpretation because you don't necessarily know whether this object was cultic, whether it was a child's toy. Um, in the ancient Near Eastern texts, we're told about recipes, so we know what kind of residues to look for. We may understand what deities they're worshiping and the kind of rituals those deities demanded. So we may have a better understanding of how they're using animals. So we know what to expect when we see bones. Um, but I think that in the US, we're seeing a much stronger emphasis on how different cultural the ancestors of those people, how they interpret their past. And I think that adds an interesting element of how do the modern day descendants of these people see their past. And having that absence of text allows a lot more interpretation, but also connection with later traditions.
So you've actually been to places like Israel, Jordan, and things like that.
Mhm.
Uh, are going to those places, dangerous? Anybody who watches Fox News or CNN for whatever reason they choose to watch them, know that these places are, in constant change or chaos. Is it dangerous, or do you have to have any like special permission to go to these places and do this kind of work?
That's a funny question, and it's a question our family members love to ask. Um, I have never found it particularly dangerous. I have traveled there as a woman by myself multiple times and never felt a threat to my safety. Um, my husband and I were there in 2014 during the Israeli-Gaza war. We were about 5 miles north of the Gazan border. So things were a little hot that year. We had the air raid sirens going off multiple times a day, usually about once every 2 hours. Um, but while that was going on, the level of technology and military defense in that area made it so that we knew that we had to take cover when the sirens went off, but we weren't particularly stressed out that something was actually going to land on top of us. Um, but that's from the military perspective. From just personal safety, and especially in consideration of a woman traveling in a Middle Eastern country, I felt that they were far more accepting of Western people than we normally expect, or that you would normally see stereotyped in the news. Um, and oftentimes when we're there, I'll just tell our family, don't check the news. Don't look at what's going on in the Middle East. You'll get a completely different curated idea of what's happening on the ground.
Like, if you could stop calling me about the war that's going on, that would be great. Like, I'm trying to work, and the war is like 5 miles that way. It's fine. Leave me alone.
It's okay. There would be times where we would be Skyping with family and I would just mute my end of it so no one had to hear the sirens go off. Um, and so that always added an exciting element to phone calls home.
Or you could just not mute it and pretend like you don't hear it and they're hearing some kind of weird noise. What is that? It's what are you talking about? I don't hear anything. It's fine.
Yeah, and I tell them, you're at home with tornadoes. You can't shoot a tornado out of a sky, and you don't know where it's going to land. It's like I'm safer with missiles falling around me.
And that sums up what it's like to be an archaeologist in the field. If it's not one natural disaster, it is another.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you never know what's going to try to kill you that day.
Yeah, I remember the first week we were out in the field doing the solar farm project, and it started just snowing. Like, and it snowed for like 2 hours, and the cover was completely like I couldn't see 2 feet in front of my face, so I stood there for like 30 minutes, just assuming
Mhm.
the snow would clear up, and then something hit me in the back of the head, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I'm like, okay, if I die out here, this is just the way it is.
At least your body would be preserved in the cold.
Yeah, I would leave a good looking frozen corpse out there for someone to find on the way out.
I
Oh,
know. Yeah, and I
oh,
was photographing a site in ankle deep ivy and saw the water moccasin about 3 feet ahead of me, right about the time he disappeared into the ivy. And I was like, there's a snake somewhere in a 3 foot radius of me, and I don't know where it is.
so yeah, the one piece of advice you can take away today, snake proof boots. We highly recommend them. They come up to your, mid knee, so it keeps you from being struck by a venomous serpent.
It's worth it. Worth the lack of mobility. You don't have to worry about dying 4 hours from help.
Yeah, they are incredibly heavy and difficult to move in, but it keeps you from dying. So you have to take the good with the bad when you're shopping for equipment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've worked in various places across the world now. Uh, what is something you've learned that transfers from all of those places?
I mean, there are general field practices, how to set up a grid, how to use the different tools, um, also how to think and interpret about what you're working with. Um, if I know now how to identify pottery from the Middle East, from the southeastern United States, because there are only so many ways you can make pottery. You know how to identify stone tools because there are only so many ways to make stone tools. Um, and also, I think just the general crossover of how do I deal with people? How do I psychologically handle days and hours in the field in all kinds of weather conditions? And the nice thing is that working in Israel and working in the southeastern United States, you are working in very similar climate zones. So you start getting used to the heat and uh, actually, we're a whole lot more humid here than we were in Israel. Um, but I kind of miss that nice dry heat. But you do start to sort of have that psychological bastion against I'm going to be in the field for hours. I am going to smell terrible, but at least everybody in the field with me smells the same. Um, and you also get that ability to relax socially with several other people of your same academic capability, who are all sweaty and tired and broken down like you are. So there are a lot of interesting transferable skills from one to another. Um, and I've kind of enjoyed just seeing what I know versus what I don't know and what I have to learn while I'm working here.
Yeah. So it is a very steep learning curve when you're out in the field. You realize that you are going to be with the same group of people. Sometimes you have to spin the roulette wheel on the group of people. You might get some people you absolutely love. You might get some people who think, I'm going to have to kill one of these people before I leave.
You
That's
can't kill them,
yeah.
society frowns on that.
Yeah, and the people leading the team kind of notice when team members are missing. Like, hey, have you seen, whoever? No, I saw him go into the woods like an hour ago. I haven't seen him since.
Mm-hmm.
I miss him.
Pour out a bottle of water for him at the end of the day.
Yeah, bottle of something because after you find some weird stuff in the field. We were out one day and somebody found a perfectly fine 6-pack of beer just in the woods. Brought it home.
That's brave.
Yeah, yeah, and Don't think we didn't try to talk them out of it on the way home.
Yeah. Yeah, that'd be terrifying.
Yeah.
Tempting, but terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, it's beer, but it's also forest beer that's been there for who knows how long.
Somebody was probably really sad to find that their stash disappeared.
At some point, yeah, you go back out there in the woods, you're probably going back from hunting, and it's like, where's my beer? It was right here.
Had plans for that 6-pack.
It was going to make the day go by so much faster. Right. So, archaeology, that is what we talk about here, not drinking in the woods.
No, no, alcoholism is not involved at all.
No, that is not what we advocate here right now because it's 12:22 in the afternoon.
And alcohol is terribly dehydrating.
It is. So, yeah, one thing that you will learn if you're out in the field, you have to stay hydrated or you will die. It is a fact, and one that several people, Rebekah and I both know, can attest to.
Mm-hmm. They'll never let you live it down.
No, you'll
No.
start wandering through the woods, hallucinating, probably hit yourself in the face with a shovel. It happens.
Yeah.
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 So, yeah.
Oh, I once spent 24 very miserable hours in an Israeli hospital because it turns out you don't just need water, you also need electrolytes.
Oh, yeah. So, when you're in a foreign country doing archaeology, like doing archaeological research, do you get like a break to come home or you are there for the entirety of the project?
So it depends on the country and the level of research that you're doing. A PhD student could reasonably expect to live there for a few months. The expeditions that I've participated in, I was not doing personal research for any of my degrees. So I only stayed there for the length of the dig. And especially in countries like Israel, the digs are seasonal. You don't dig the entire year round. You dig in the summer because that's the dry season. Because once the end of September, early October hits, it's going to be raining until about May. So there's usually a very narrow, about a 3-month window where expeditions are working in the field. And it's also the summertime when all the American professors are off and they can take their students with them. But I do know PhD students who will get there in the summer and they may live there in Israel for, a year or more as they're doing research, because it's much easier to not have to petition a foreign government to let you export artifacts to take back home to research yourself.
So, that was going to be my next question. You do actually get to bring back the stuff you find, or they keep it there in that country for cultural appropriational reasons?
So, yes, I'm familiar with Israeli law. I can't speak to all other Middle Eastern countries, but with Israel, there is no true personal land ownership. The government of Israel owns all of the land, and by that nature, then they own all the artifacts coming out of the land. So everything is national Israeli property. And they have a very large warehouse where they store all of their artifacts, kind of like the Indiana Jones, where we keep the Ark of the Covenant kind of warehouse. But you can petition for an export license to borrow artifacts to take back to the United States for a short time. And that includes even soil samples. You can borrow soil from the Israeli government, but when you're done testing it, they expect it back.
So you can't just use up the entire soil sample. You have to send them something back.
I don't know. I've never done soil samples from Israel. Um, So I don't know precisely what, I mean, maybe you're just sending back a tag that said, hey, there used to be dirt here.
We had some sand of yours and we used it, so it's gone now.
Hmm.
Thank you.
It was great sand. Told us a lot.
We learned a lot from your sand. There, it's gone now.
Hmm. We used it all.
Yeah. Um, so what else do you think people should know as working as an archaeologist?
Hmm. You really have to be flexible. Um, you have to
You
be
mean
flexible.
do
Yeah.
you mean mentally or physically? Because I have experience having to be both.
The answer is yes. Mentally, you have to be able to make decisions based on the context that you're in. We have rules, we have laws and principles. The laws, you can't break those. Um, but some of the rules, you may have to determine how to apply them on the ground. Um, because we may demand that, sure, everyone's having to dig 30-centimeter shovel test every 30 feet, but you might be in the middle of a swamp. And then you have to decide, am I going to call this a no dig zone, or am I going to send everybody in, ankle deep water to dig a hole that you can record no data from? So you have to know what rules you can bend, which of them you can suspend for the moment. And yes, a bit of physical flexibility is really, really nice, especially when you're climbing rocks or climbing over deadfalls or under, or just sucking up to the fact that you're about to step in water that is going to go over your boot top and it's cold. So,
Yes, there is nothing like having your boots filled with cold water and realizing that there's a living thing in your boot.
oh yeah.
That
And
is so very nice and squishy, and it is a feeling that you will never get over as a person.
you kind of have to hope that whatever it is sharing the boot with you isn't hungry.
Yeah, because your soaking toes do look very appetizing after a little bit.
I mean, hey, you can't be too picky if you're living in a cold, muddy creek.
Yeah, I mean, you have to realize that, hey, somebody might step on me. I might not want to live here.
Hmm.
So you were talking about the rules and the laws, how to bend them but not break them. What are some rules that we as archaeologists try to stick to in the field?
Well, there are the standard ones of making sure that we are scientifically gathering data. So ensuring that we are taking the proper measurements. And from especially a commercial cultural resource management perspective, we have told the customer that we are going to be digging this number of shovel tests in this area to this depth. And the customer has the right to audit us on those. So we don't want them to come back and say, hey, you said you were going to do this in your contract and then you didn't. And we went back and audited one of your shovel tests and we found an arrow, a biface in it. So, how great of an archaeologist are you in your company? So, contractual rules, we want to stick to those. Um, and we also want to stick with our ethical codes. If we come across a burial, we want to ensure that we treat that burial with respect, that we notify the proper agencies or tribes that could be associated with that burial. We want to ensure that we document the artifacts accurately so that others can come behind us and duplicate our research or actually use our research to understand the area or the culture or the context better. Um, so sometimes we're following rules because we don't want to get in trouble or arrested or lose contracts. But other times we're following rules because we want to be ethical or we want to clear the path for researchers that are going to be coming behind us.
So you talked about being under contract. What does that actually mean for people who haven't actually done an archaeological dig somewhere and don't know what it's like to do it professionally? Professionalism is a broad term.
That's fair. Yeah, there's the joke about what's the best thing that you've ever found in archaeology, and the punchline is a job.
It's not incorrect.
Mm. So there is academic archaeology where you're working with professors, you're working with universities. And what I do now, my end of it, is the commercial cultural resource management. So an entity who wants to develop land is going to seek us out, sometimes voluntarily because they're ethical in their land development, sometimes because federal law demands that a CRM company or firm comes and surveys the land before they develop it. But we will sign a contract, and in those contracts, we guarantee the work that we're going to do. We tell them how much it's going to cost and break down how much everybody is going to pay. We talk about the time frame, so we'll have contractual time frame limits. We have to be done with our field work by this date. We are going to give you a report that you're going to pay us for by another date. We outline the kind of data we're going to provide. We stipulate how many artifacts that we will record and curate. So we may not necessarily curate everything that we keep out of the field. Some of it may not tell us anything. And so we have slightly different guidelines from an academic dig, because those guidelines are based on how much the customer is willing to pay us, and if they're willing for us to go over budget if we find something particularly interesting.
Is it stressful to be under that kind of scrutiny in a professional archaeological environment to make sure that you produce results or make, well, there's really no guarantee you could actually produce results, is there?
There's not. And actually, a lot of customers would really hope that you don't produce results, because depending on what you find, it may mean that they have to change their development plans. I think the stressful part comes from, if you do find something, what is the customer going to do with it? Are they going to want to preserve that cultural resource? If it's a cool enough resource, if it tells us a lot, we can get legal protections for it and add that area to the National Registry of Historic Places, so that development on that land is very limited. But in cases where we just have an artifact scatter, the customer may decide to go ahead and develop that area. Or they may, if they're a private landowner, all of those artifacts belong to them now, because of US property laws. And so what are they going to do with those artifacts once we turn them over to them? Are they going to use them ethically? Are they going to sell them? I think the stress there in an academic dig is going to be, am I going to produce something? Am I going to learn something from this? And the stress in CRM work is, what is the customer going to do with what I find?
So for a CRM firm, do they actually keep the artifacts they find, or are they do they present them at like conferences or things like that, or do they just keep them for cataloging purposes?
So we actually don't keep anything that we find unless a private collector asks us to curate a collection for them. For example, if we're working for TVA, all of the artifacts we find belong to them, and many of these large, especially government companies, we'll have warehouses and repositories where once we have documented and cataloged all the artifacts, we'll then ship them to their repositories. So that might be Moundville in Tuscaloosa, it might be Mississippi State. It just depends on the area and the customer where those artifacts will go.
Okay. So the TVA, that's the Tennessee Valley Authority, they do a lot of the contract work here in the Southeast, really. What
Yeah.
uh what kind of thing, what kind of contracts do they normally dish out? Like what kind of work do they want people to do in the field?
So oftentimes TVA is looking for surveying, where we will go out and just either dig shovel test or do pedestrian surveys to look for cultural resources, because they may want to especially expand a dam, or they may want to repair power lines or transmission structures. Every once in a while, they'll want to build something new, for example, a solar farm. And so they'll send a surveying crew out to tracts of land that they're considering to purchase to build that infrastructure project on. So we might be going out in the middle of cornfields with no other infrastructure nearby to see if this is a good place. If there are any cultural resources that a solar farm could disrupt if they built it there.
What do you mean by disrupt?
In some cases, if it is say a village site from an American Indian community, if the infrastructure project would not involve digging down into it, if it were a certain number of centimeters from the surface, they may be cleared to do whatever they need to, as long as they don't dig so far down that they hit that cultural resource and destroy it or disrupt it, where they may dig up part of a village or they may begin uncovering burials from that site.
So in that case, would those artifacts just be left where they are undisturbed, or would somebody come back and get them later?
It depends. Um, if it could aid the research and our understanding of that tribe or community or culture, then it would be reasonable that a team may go back and do what we would call phase 2 or a phase 3 survey, where we would actually have a full-blown excavation of that area, because then we can document it, we can gather the artifacts for research. If we don't think that it's going to contribute enough to our understanding, we may just let it lie. And in some cases, you may excavate part of it, but you might leave half of it or parts of the structures unexcavated, because we have technology now and we have scientific methods now that allow us to research and to understand what we're looking at. But archaeologists also understand that we don't have everything. We will have improvements in our technology and our digging methodology in the future. So maybe let's leave a little bit of it for future archaeologists to come back and do better and to improve on our work.
Yeah, that's something, I think people need to understand when they get into archaeology as a practice, as a field of study, is there's always going to be something more. There's always some little piece of something that is still out there to find, maybe a new piece of technology to help us find something
Mhm.
else.
And we're a destructive science. So once we excavate something, it's gone. You can't reverse engineer an excavation because you're blowing through things, you're digging them up, you're removing them from context.
Yeah, we try by backfilling holes, but that hole's never the same once you fill it back in. It's just horrible looking.
No, no, that those strata, those are gone.
So for the closing question, I know you've recommended going to observing a field school, going to various historical sites. What other advice could you give somebody who's trying to get started in archaeology as either a career or a field of study?
I would recommend reading. Read about the methodology that you're interested in, if you're interested in New World or Old World methodology, but also read about the history of these areas, because you can always just be a dirt monkey where you go and you're digging holes all day and you're pulling artifacts out and putting them in bags and giving them to somebody else. But if you read about the history of that area or the history of the culture that you're interested in, you're not just a dirt monkey, you're a real archaeologist, because the things that you're pulling out, the strata that you're seeing, you're understanding it now, and you understand how it fits into the greater context of the, not just the excavation, but the context of the culture and the geographic region that you're working in.
Are there any books that you're particularly attached to as far as like studying archaeology? Like, do you have a favorite or one you'd recommend?
Well, if you're in Middle Eastern archaeology, there are plenty. The Oxford um, reference books are great for Middle Eastern archaeology and really even American archaeology. Um, for the Southeast, um, there are books. I'm trying to think of the one that I've got. The Prehistoric Indians of the Southeast is a very good go-to as far as a nice summary of the time periods that you would find in Alabama, and the Southeast in general, as well as the artifacts that you would be expected to be associated with those cultures. Um, I mean, there are always textbooks. I also recommend just scholarly articles. The SAA has some really great journals out that will provide a lot of up-to-date research on what's going on in the field now.
Yeah, that's one thing I recommend personally is something like JSTOR or academia.net. You can type in archaeology in general, or if you want to get more specific, you can type in the region you're looking at and
Hmm.
archaeology, and it'll give you almost everything you need just to kill time with reading.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah,
much reading.
almost overwhelming. It's wonderful.
Oh, yeah. So the last question, Dirt Monkey, that is the first time I've ever heard that one. I've heard
Yeah,
shovel bomb, whole person, and those are the two I've heard.
yeah,
but
yeah. I think shovel bomb's a little less pejorative.
but Dirt Monkey is a new one, and I have to know where you heard.
I could not tell you. I picked it up somewhere and loved it. But it's descriptive.
Oh yeah, it's perfectly valid. That's why I like it so much. Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode. Rebekah, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this was great.